Reed Callahan spotted the hazard lights blinking against the gray afternoon sky half a mile before he reached them. And his first instinct was to keep driving. He was already late. The sealed envelope on his passenger seat had been sitting there for 3 days without explanation. And the road into Dunmore Valley turned treacherous after rain. But he had grown up on these roads, and he knew what it looked like when someone had no idea where the nearest help was coming from. He pulled the inspection truck onto the gravel shoulder, behind the disabled sedan, and climbed out into the cold. The woman standing beside the open hood wore a charcoal blazer that had not been designed for rain, and she looked at him the way people sometimes looked at an unexpected complication, assessing, calculating whether he was useful, or simply another problem layered on top of the one she already had. She introduced herself as Annette Vorel, said the car had simply stopped responding, and then checked her watch before he had finished nodding. Reed looked under the hood without being asked. He had been reading electrical failures in heavy equipment for 22 years, and this one took him less than 90 seconds to identify. He told her plainly that the fault was buried in the vehicle's control module, that it could not be repaired on the side of a county road, and that whoever had last serviced this car would have questions to answer. Annette Vorel said she needed to be at an address on Meridian Hollow Road before 5 o'clock, that the matter could not be rescheduled, and that she would pay him whatever he considered reasonable if he would simply drive faster than the road signs suggested. Reed told her the road signs existed for a reason and offered her a ride without attaching a price to it. She paused for a moment, as though weighing the dignity cost of climbing into a truck that smelled faintly of machine oil and pine resin, and then she got in. She did not ask anything about him during the first 10 minutes, and Reed did not volunteer anything. He was accustomed to silence. After his wife, Carol, died 3 years earlier, he had discovered that silence was something he could carry without effort, a quality that sometimes unnerved people who expected conversation to fill every space. The cab held the small evidence of his life as it currently existed. A child's watercolor taped to the dashboard, painted in the loose, enthusiastic style of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned to be cautious about color. Opal had painted it the previous spring and told him it was a bridge, though it resembled a rainbow, more than any bridge he had inspected professionally. He had kept it there anyway. Annette Vorel checked her watch again, and then, with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to cutting through pleasantries, asked him exactly what had brought him onto a back road in the middle of the week, carrying what appeared to be surveying equipment. Reed said he ran a small structural inspection firm out of the town of Crestfall, 14 miles south. He said nothing further, because the longer answer involved explanations he had learned to give only when someone actually wanted them. When the truck crested the ridge and her phone caught a brief signal, a message arrived from someone she identified only as Frederick, urging her in clipped corporate language to agree to whatever terms were presented, to avoid any discussion of internal financials, and above all not to allow the meeting to extend past 6 o'clock. Something in the message tightened the line of her jaw in a way she did not appear to notice. Reed noticed. He had spent years reading stress patterns in things that looked solid from the outside. He asked, without particular emphasis, where on Meridian Hollow Road she was headed. She read him the number from the letter in her bag, 214 Meridian Hollow, the Pratt estate. She said the name as though it required no explanation, as though everyone in the county would naturally understand its significance. Reed eased his foot off the accelerator. He reached into the side pocket of his jacket and produced his own envelope. It had arrived 4 days ago, bearing a notary seal he did not recognize, and the name of an attorney he had never met, requesting his presence at the Pratt estate on this specific afternoon at this specific hour, and offering no further explanation beyond the instruction that his attendance was required as a condition of the estate's principal bequest. He handed it to Annette Vorel without comment. She read the address printed on the front and then read it again. She looked at him with a new quality of attention that had nothing to do with whether he was useful for getting her where she needed to go. Reed pulled the truck onto the next available shoulder and let the engine idle while she opened his envelope and examined the seal, the attorney's signature, the verification code along the bottom margin. He watched her compare it, line by line, against the letter she carried. The seals matched. The attorney matched. The codes corresponded. The only difference was in how each letter described the person it addressed. Hers named her as the company steward. His named him as the principal technical witness. Annette Vorel looked up from the letters and asked him directly who he was. Reed told her. He had spent 8 years as the chief materials analyst at a firm called Halloran Structural before a catastrophic failure at the Dunmore Overpass project had ended his career 5 years ago. The investigation had placed responsibility on miscalculations in the composite load data, and the miscalculations had been traced to documents bearing Reed's professional certification. He had lost his license for 2 years, his reputation for considerably longer, and his position permanently. He had rebuilt from nothing, slowly and without help from anyone who had known him before. Annette Vorel was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that Oswald Pratt had been the lead materials scientist on the original Dunmore Overpass specification, that she had known Oswald for 15 years, that Vorel Marston Construction Materials had been one of his primary research partners, and that his passing 6 weeks earlier had left her company's most valuable pending patent in legal uncertainty. Neither of them said the obvious thing yet, which was that a dead engineer's decision to summon them both to the same address at the same hour was not an accident. Reed pulled back onto the road and drove. The Pratt estate sat at the end of a quarter-mile gravel lane, its main house a broad fieldstone structure that had been built to last by people who took that ambition seriously. As Reed guided the truck through the stone gate pillars, they passed 2 black SUVs with tinted windows and a silver company car, bearing the Vorel Marston corporate logo on the door panel, which meant Frederick had arrived ahead of them. The man who stepped off the front porch as they parked was tall and expensively dressed in the specific way of people who considered clothing a form of argument. Frederick Holbrook, Annette Vorel's chief financial officer, came down the steps with a smile that arrived before he had finished calculating. He greeted Annette warmly, glanced at Reed's truck with the brief dismissive appraisal of someone who had already decided what they were looking at, and then extended a business card toward Reed and suggested, in a tone designed to sound helpful, that the estate's facilities manager could be reached around back if Reed needed to speak with someone about the service entrance. Reed did not take the card. He said he was here for the meeting. Frederick Holbrook's smile remained in place, but its wattage shifted slightly. He told Annette, in the careful voice of a person making a point while appearing to make an observation, that it would be unusual and potentially disruptive to have an unknown third party present during what was meant to be a confidential legal proceeding. He suggested, gently, that Annette might have been taken advantage of by someone who had recognized a situation and invented a connection to it. Annette Vorel said nothing. She had not yet decided what she believed, and her silence fell between Reed and Frederick Holbrook like a wall that could tip either direction. It was the estate's attorney who resolved the moment. Constance Reyes came through the front door in a dark wool suit, carrying a leather document case, and she crossed directly to where Reed stood and extended her hand before she acknowledged anyone else. She told him that the meeting could not begin without his presence, that his role in Oswald Pratt's estate was not incidental but central, and that his letter had been sent with the same authority and under the same legal terms as every other letter issued by the estate. She then looked at Frederick Holbrook and told him, without particular heat, that the seating arrangement inside had been determined by Oswald Pratt's own instructions, and that he would find his name at the far end of the table. The library inside the Pratt house smelled of old paper and machine oil in equal measure, the kind of room that belonged to someone who had spent equal time thinking and building. A projector had been set up at one end. Constance Reyes took her position, opened her document case, and explained that Oswald Pratt had recorded a final statement before his death, and that he had required both designated parties to be physically present before it could be played. She looked at Annette, and then at Reed, confirmed both were in the room, and started the recording. Oswald Pratt appeared on the screen as a man in his mid-70s, with the particular stillness of someone who had made a decision and then lived with it long enough to understand its full weight. He spoke without preamble. He said that the composite stress analysis that had been submitted under Reed Callahan's professional certification during the Dunmore Overpass project had not been authored by Reed Callahan. He said he had known this at the time and had said nothing. He said the actual source of the falsified data was a set of internal documents generated by Vorel Marston's Materials Testing Division, altered to conceal a production variance in a structural polymer batch that the company had already shipped and could not recall without catastrophic financial and legal consequences. He said that a junior analyst named Reed Callahan had been the most convenient available explanation, and that the people who made that calculation had included himself. Reed sat with his hands folded on the table and did not look at anyone while the recording played. His jaw had gone slightly tight in the way of someone receiving news they had waited a long time for, in a form they could not have predicted. Oswald continued. He described the terms of his bequest. Reed Callahan would be named the estate's principal technical witness, holding the authority to verify or contest any future use of Pratt's research patents, including the composite thermal bonding process that Vorel Marston had been hoping to license for the past 2 years. Annette Vorel would retain her role as commercial steward of the company, but could not execute any licensing agreement without Reed Callahan's written certification that the technology met independent safety standards. If no agreement was reached within 24 hours, the patents would transfer to a university research trust and remain outside commercial use for 12 years. Frederick Holbrook produced an offer immediately after the recording ended. He named a number, placed it on the table in front of Reed, and framed it as a gesture of goodwill, a way of avoiding delay and getting to an agreement that served everyone's interest. Reed looked at the number without touching the paper and said he was not interested in a number. He said he was interested in understanding why the polymer batch variance had never been corrected and whether the material was still in structural use anywhere. Frederick told him, in the patient tone of a man rerouting a conversation he found inconvenient, that those questions were historical and could be addressed separately, that the current priority was the licensing agreement, and that nothing in Oswald Pratt's will required Reed to conduct any kind of independent investigation before signing. Reed said that was precisely what he intended to find out. Constance Reyes placed a key on the table. She explained that Oswald had maintained a working archive below the house, accessible only to the 2 named parties together. She said what was in it would likely answer questions that the recording had not. The archive was a single basement room lined with filing cabinets, a long work table, and a server unit that had been carefully maintained despite years of disuse. Reed powered it on from a sequence he found printed inside the key case, and Annette watched the screens come alive with the focus of someone recalibrating what she thought she understood. He moved through the directory with the ease of someone who understood how engineers organized evidence, and she pulled financial records alongside him from the physical files, her hands steady and efficient. They found the internal Vorel Marston testing logs within the first hour. The variance reports were there, time-stamped and initialed, recording a 17% deviation in the polymer's shear resistance that fell outside the project specification. The logs showed the deviation being flagged, reviewed, and then reclassified under a document authorization code that did not belong to anyone in the testing division. Reed traced the authorization code. It belonged to Frederick Holbrook. He turned the screen toward Annette and walked her through it without rushing. The code appeared on the reclassification. It appeared again on the revised classification sheet submitted to the project contractor, and it appeared a third time on the internal risk assessment that had been quietly updated after Reed's certification was attached to the falsified analysis, shifting the evidentiary trail in a way that would only become visible if someone knew exactly where to look. Annette stood very still for a long moment. She said Frederick had been with the company for 11 years. She said he had been present for every major decision, every crisis, every restructuring. She said her late husband, who had built Vorel Marston from a regional supplier into a national materials firm, had trusted Frederick Holbrook completely. Reed said that what a person did when no one was watching was the only reliable measure of who they actually were. They did not yet know that Frederick had already gone upstairs and made a phone call. When they returned to the library 40 minutes later, the server archive had been remotely wiped. The filing cabinet that had held the testing logs was standing open and empty. The house's network access log showed an external login that had cleared the system's primary storage drive, and the secondary backup that Reed had copied to a portable drive now showed corrupted data when he connected it. Frederick Holbrook expressed measured concern about the apparent system failure. He suggested, with the practiced gravity of someone who had done this before, that the archive had always been unstable, that Oswald Pratt had been known to keep disorganized records, and that perhaps whatever Reed believed he had found in there deserved more careful scrutiny before anyone drew conclusions. The competing offer arrived 90 minutes later. Frederick presented it as a solution, a new licensing structure that would give Reed a consulting fee, a non-disclosure agreement regarding the Dunmore overpass findings, and a clean public record acknowledging that the original investigation had involved procedural ambiguities. In exchange, he would certify the current patent licensing agreement by 8 o'clock that evening, and Vorel Marston's credit facility would be secured before the markets opened the following morning. Reed read the document to the last line and set it down without signing. Frederick turned to Annette then, and his voice changed register. He reminded her how many people worked at Vorel Marston's 3 manufacturing facilities. He reminded her that the company's debt obligations had a hard review date in 11 days. He reminded her that her late husband had built something worth preserving, and that preserving it required practical decisions, not principled gestures that would accomplish nothing, beyond making a man who was already owed an apology feel temporarily vindicated. Annette picked up the document. She read it herself. She set it back down on Frederick's side of the table. She told him that her husband had built the company on the claim that materials used in public infrastructure had to meet the standard they were certified to, that this was the reason people trusted the Vorel Marston name, and that a company whose name rested on a buried lie was not a company worth preserving on those terms. Frederick's composure broke in a small, specific way. He said that sentimentality was a luxury she could not afford, that the alternative was bankruptcy and 2,000 people out of work, and that Reed Callahan had already been compensated by the original settlement and had no legitimate claim to anything further. Reed said, quietly, that he had received no settlement, that he had never been offered one because the findings against him had been treated as conclusive, and the investigation had been closed without appeal. The room went still. Constance Reyes, who had been waiting in the doorway with a patience that suggested she had anticipated this moment, stepped forward and placed a small external drive on the table. She explained that Oswald Pratt had sent her a secondary archive 6 weeks before his death, encrypted and held in her firm's secure storage, with instructions to produce it only if both parties were present and a dispute arose over the integrity of the estate's own records. She connected it to her laptop and turned the screen so everyone could see. The testing logs were there, the authorization codes were there, and a third item was there that had not been in the basement archive. A private correspondence between Oswald Pratt and Frederick Holbrook, dated 4 years earlier, in which Frederick acknowledged in writing that the reclassification had originated with him, and asked Oswald to maintain silence in exchange for a continued consulting arrangement with Vorel Marston's patent division worth 6 figures annually. Frederick Holbrook left the room and did not return voluntarily. He was still in the building when Constance Reyes notified the company's board of directors and placed a call to the state licensing board. The board convened by video at 7 the following morning. Annette Vorel had not slept. She had spent the night preparing a restructuring plan with Reed's technical input, working at the dining room table of the Pratt estate while Constance Reyes handled the preliminary legal notifications. Reed had not slept either, though he had stepped outside twice to call Opal, keeping his voice easy and steady so she would not worry about where he was or what the next day would bring for either of them. The board was skeptical at first. One member asked directly how a company in Vorel Marston's current financial position could risk the reputational exposure of the Dunmore Overpass disclosure becoming public. Annette told them that the exposure was not a risk. It was an obligation. She told them that the company's credibility in the infrastructure materials market rested entirely on its claim to safety standards, and that claiming those standards while concealing a known violation from 5 years ago was not a business position, it was a liability with a timer on it. She then presented the restructuring plan. Vorel Marston would license Oswald Pratt's composite thermal bonding patents through a structure that placed independent safety certification authority with Reed Callahan. The terms of that certification would be public. The Dunmore Overpass findings would be disclosed to state and federal transportation authorities with Vorel Marston's full cooperation. In exchange for that cooperation, the company's insurers had already indicated preliminary willingness to treat the disclosure as a compliance event rather than an act of concealment, which altered the liability exposure substantially. 3 institutional investors who had been quietly approached through Constance Reyes's network. The previous evening had reviewed the plan overnight and confirmed they were prepared to provide bridge financing contingent on the board's acceptance. Frederick Holbrook's seat on the executive committee was vacant by 8 o'clock. The licensing agreement was signed before noon in the same library where Oswald Pratt's recording had played the previous afternoon. Reed Callahan's name appeared on it as the Independent Technical Authority, a designation that Constance Reyes later described to a state transportation board official as carrying more genuine accountability than most corporate safety titles she had seen in 20 years of estate law. In the weeks that followed, the Dunmore Overpass findings were submitted to the appropriate authorities, with the documentation Oswald Pratt had preserved. Reed's professional certification was formally reinstated. The record of the original investigation was amended. None of it gave back the 5 years, or the years before that, when the shadow of the allegation had made it difficult to find work in the field he had spent his career building. He did not expect it to. He kept his inspection business running out of Crestfall. He kept the same truck. He went to Opal's school events on time and coached her soccer team on Saturday mornings in the fall. The routine of it suited him in a way that a corner office in a downtown building would not have. And when a large materials firm offered him a senior director position based on the public acknowledgement of his credentials, he declined with the same lack of drama he had declined Frederick Holbrook's offer. Annette Vorel drove out to Crestfall 2 months after the board meeting, arriving without a corporate car, and without the precise defensive composure she had worn the first time he had seen her standing in the rain beside a disabled sedan. She brought the finalized partnership documentation and the independent audit results, which had come back cleaner than even the more optimistic projections. She also brought, because Opal had somehow been mentioned in a conversation and the detail had stayed with her, a set of professional watercolor paints that she said had been recommended by a friend who taught art. She thanked him, simply and without the careful phrasing of a prepared statement. She said that the decision he had helped her make had cost the company something in the short term that was already being rebuilt on a foundation she could actually stand on. Reed told her that the decision had been hers, that he had only made the other options visible. They stood in the gravel lot beside his truck for a while. As the afternoon light flattened over the hills, the sounds of the highway faint in the distance, Opal's voice audible somewhere inside the building where she had retreated to investigate the paints. The conversation moved in the way of people who have already been through something difficult together and found that the difficulty did not diminish what they thought of each other. Before she left, Annette asked whether Reed might be willing to drive up to the Pratt estate sometime in the coming months. The University Research Trust that had been established from the remaining patent provisions was converting the property into an engineering training center. And there was a technical review committee that needed an independent materials authority to chair it. She said the drive was straightforward as long as the weather cooperated, though she acknowledged the road had a tendency to be unkind to certain vehicles. Reed said he thought he could manage the road. He asked whether she had gotten her sedan repaired, and she told him she had sold it. She said she was driving something easier to manage in the mountains now, gesturing toward a modest wagon parked at the lot entrance that looked nothing like what a CEO was expected to arrive in. Reed said it looked reliable. Annette said that was exactly why she had chosen it. She drove away in the early evening light, and Reed stood for a moment in the lot before going inside to find Opal. His daughter had spread the new paints across the work table and was in the early stages of something ambitious, a painting that involved mountains and a road and, somewhere in the composition, what appeared to be a truck. He asked her what she was making. Opal said it was a story. She said she was still working out how it ended. Reed sat down across from her and watched her paint, in no particular hurry to be anywhere else.